Buenos días. Muchas gracias al profesor Guido Alfani por estar acá, aceptar esta invitación, y también a ustedes por estar presentes. Es un evento en conjunto con la Universidad de Cartagena, la Asociación Colombiana de Historia Económica y la Red de Investigadores del Banco de la República. El profesor Guido Alfani es profesor de la Universidad de Historia Económica. Sus intereses sobre todo son la movilidad social desde la era preindustrial. Ha trabajado cosas también de la antigüedad, trabaja desigualdad económica, desigualdad social. Es un demógrafo también y ha trabajado el efecto de las crisis, de las guerras y de las pandemias, los efectos económicos. Y hoy nos va a presentar un libro sobre las élites en Occidente, una visión de largo plazo. Vamos a dejar más o menos unos 45 minutos de presentación y al final sería ideal que ustedes hicieran preguntas. Se las pueden hacer en español, tal vez responda en español o en inglés. Vamos a ver cómo hacemos eso, pero bueno, bienvenidos a participar. Y Guido, gracias de nuevo por estar acá.
Gracias, muchas gracias Juliana por esta presentación y muchas gracias a todos los colegas por haberme invitado aquí. Está verdaderamente en inglés. A pleasure to be here. So I'm sorry my presentation is in English. I will be able hopefully to answer questions in Spanish later. As Juliana mentioned, I'm presenting you this book, which is about the rich in the West in the long run of history. The book covers mostly the last 1,000 years, so beginning with the so-called commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th century, which happened in the Mediterranean area mostly, and sometimes going back to even classical antiquity. But the idea is really to focus on long-run dynamics. The book is divided in 3 parts. The first is about how we can define wealth and how rich were the rich in the past. The second is about which were the main paths to become rich, wealthy in history. And finally, a substantial final part is about the role played by the rich in society. By the way, if I talk too much, you'll warn me, okay? Give me tell me when I have 10 minutes left, something like that. So I will tell you a little about this first part and something more about the other 2. What I will tell you, and what I will begin with, is a general impression of wealth inequality and the concentration of wealth at the very top of society across history. Beginning with the pre-industrial period. For Europe, we can sometimes go back, based on the documents we have, to the very beginning of the 14th century, to just before the Black Death pandemic, which began in 1347, and which killed about half the people of Europe and the Mediterranean. And then we can continue up until the very end of the early modern period. We can do this for some areas only, we can do this partly for England, and we can do this for many different parts of Italy. There is still much work going on, but the general impression we get from the regions of Europe which we have been able to explore, and by the way, this is the wealth share of the richest 5%, which is one among different definitions of the wealthy which I use, right? So, the general impression we get is that from the very end of the Middle Ages till the end of the early modern period, the wealth share for the top 5% increased continuously. If we expand this to the previous period, we find that the Black Death epidemic was an event able to trigger a long phase of inequality reduction. Now, the main exception we know about to this general story is that of Germany, which basically follows, and that's the green line, yes, it's the green line here. It follows exactly the same path as the others, except for the 17th century, when there is a second phase of inequality decline in Germany, triggered by the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was the most destructive war of pre-industrial Europe, plus terrible plagues in the 1620s. And this was a catastrophe destructive enough to trigger this second phase of inequality reduction. Now, this graph ends at 1800. If we move forward, and in this case we can relatively say something also about the United States. We have some information from the very end of the colonial period of the United States. We observe a continued inequality growth, again, wealth, and by the way, this is the top 1% instead. When we think about wealth shares, I use two main definitions, the top 5% and the top 1%, right? And sometimes I have to look at even smaller percentiles because we don't have information about broader strata of society. And these definitions are the two most popular ones in the literature, but they're not without issues, as I will explain later. Anyway, inequality growth till the beginning of World War I, and then a second phase of inequality decline, lasting until the early 1970s. The first phase of this decline is usually considered to be connected to the impact, the direct impact of the world wars. The examples you have on this graph are those of France, Sweden, and the United States. And the second, however, after the end of World War II, is usually connected to the development of the welfare state systems and to very substantial fiscal redistribution. Now, this general story is correct if we don't forget about the fact that the development of very progressive taxation of pretty much everything, wealth, income, inheritances, begins in the World War period, right? It was also part of the social contract which was set up to allow the states to fight the war. So you imagine World War I, you have to send people to the trenches, you have to give something back to them, and what was given was, on the one hand, more political rights, in the terms of, for example, the right to vote in elections, but also substantial, a kind of taxation which was hitting in different ways the different strata of society. One way of putting it is that in this phase, as labor has to be conscribed to be sent to the front, also capital had to be conscribed to have to pay for the war effort. After the 1970s, we have this well-known resumption of the tendency for wealth inequality and income inequality, by the way, to grow again, which is a general process across Western societies. I don't have the time to talk to you about this, but this is also connected to changes in fiscal policies across the West. If we bring everything together, and this is like the last 700 years, again, wealth share of the 1%, we have really this impression, which is somehow depressing to me, that the long-run tendency for wealth inequality has been growth. So wealth has tended to become ever more concentrated in few hands, and the only two phases in which this process was interrupted were triggered by large-scale catastrophe. Now, this is basically, correct, but if we put too much the stress on catastrophes as the explanation for this whole process, we might forget that both inequality decline in the 20th century and inequality growth in the early modern century was depending a lot on how societies were intentionally organized. So human agency matters a lot in this story. So we shouldn't describe this as a kind of unnatural process, a natural tendency for inequality to grow. And unfortunately, as only catastrophes can reduce it, you could think, okay, so we have to live with that because the cure is worth the illness. Fact is, history also suggests that a lot of this story depends on choice, so on principle we could choose different. Anyway, this is kind of beyond the scope of my presentation today. A problem we have when we define the rich based on top wealth shares is that we are basically implying that across time and across societies, the rich are a fixed percentage of society. If I focus on the share of the top 5%, it's always been, the top 5% of the rich is 5% of the people. How can we go beyond this? Well, one way of doing this is to define the rich in a relative way. In this case, those who were above 10 times the median value. If you do this, and interestingly enough, we can do this for pre-industrial societies, at least those which I've studied in my projects, because we focus on the complete distribution, but we don't have the data to do this for modern societies, right? So if we do this for the periods and areas where we can do it, we find that the prevalence of the rich, those who are above 10%, 10 times the median value, increases from the beginning of the early modern period till the end of the early modern times. The exception is again that of Germany. And again, if you look at the earlier periods, the Black Death seems to have reduced a bit the prevalence of the rich. So this tells you that in the early modern times, at the same time we have that the richest are growing richer in terms of their wealth share, and the rich are becoming more abundant, right? So you have more people who are way above the middling and lower levels of society. Now, moving to the second part, and here I will tell you something more really. If we have to think about the main paths to affluence across history, I think that three really have to be highlighted. One is that of nobility/aristocracy. The second is entrepreneurship and innovation, and from these I distinguish that of finance. Of course, there were also other paths to affluence, for example, exercising a liberal profession, even in a pre-industrial context. The fact of being, for example, a lawyer or a doctor was a path to wealth, but in general, I think that these are the most important ones to focus on, both in terms of their, significance, in terms of how many people were becoming rich in this way, and also in terms of how this shapes our understanding of the rich and wealth across history. Now, if we begin with the path of nobility, I usually show this slide without names. I always ask if you can identify any of these three people. One of them, the middle one, he is also relevant to colonial history there. So not Colombian history, as far as I know. This is a bit of a difficult start, I know. So, this guy here, Alan the Red, followed William the Conqueror in the 11th century in England. So he joined William during the conquest of England. He fought with him at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He remained in England instead of going back to Normandy as many of those who followed William. Now, he was really a minor noble, like I think it was the sixth son of an earl of Normandy, and he clearly, remaining in Normandy, wouldn't have had access to any substantial resources, but he remained in England, and he also developed a useful specialty, which was that of quenching rebellions. And thanks to this, service paid to the king, he was given most of the lands of the rebels, and he became extremely wealthy. There is a somehow funny statistic which looks at the share of the total product of England to command, and based on these statistics, he might have been the richest person ever to live in Britain, like if you don't consider kings. So he basically made his wealth, and he was born a noble. Now, one big problem with nobility is, first, how to acquire it, and second, whether you made the wealth of the family or you inherited it. The second guy here, Antoine II Crozat, he wasn't born a noble. Actually, his father, Antoine I, had tried to follow a path towards becoming a noble, but he didn't go beyond marrying a noble woman. And the family specialty originally was collecting taxes for the king. Antoine II Crozat, at the end of the 11th century, became the general tax collector of the King of France, Louis XIV. And this proximity to the king also gave him access to additional opportunities. He actually was given the monopoly of the slave trade with the Spanish colonies. And in 1712, he was also given the monopoly of the Louisiana trade, right? And he set up the Louisiana company, basically. At that moment, he might have been the richest person in France, and Voltaire called him Croesus, from Croesus, the ancient king of Brigands and super rich person. But importantly for what I want to tell you is that he was trying hard to push the king, Louis XIV, to make him a noble, and he succeeded. The king made him a noble, and the point is, why did he want to become a noble? Why all this fuss? Also because the old nobility was looking down on him as kind of a parvenu. And the point is, we find across the early modern period and well into the 19th century, actually to the very end of the 19th century, the people who made their fortunes in trade or entrepreneurship very often wanted to become a noble because they knew that this gave them access to additional opportunities. Being close to the court was an opportunity. It was an opportunity for this guy here. It was an opportunity for those who were seeking nobility, say, in the context of Imperial Germany at the end of the 90s. His children were the first, however, in the family who actually were considered by the other nobles to be real nobles. They were perfectly integrated in the top nobility of France. He, of course, also made the wealth of the family. The last person here is Duke Grosvenor, the current Duke of Westminster. His family is recent nobility by British standards because they became nobles only in the 17th century. And the fortune of the family depends on the fact that at some point they acquired lands around, close to London, which were swamps at the time, but today are some of the richest neighborhoods of London itself. So simply by owning it and inheriting it, he made the really top 10 list of the richest persons in England, and this family is always present in them. And this is a general problem we have with nobility, because nobility allows us to focus the attention on inherited wealth. And inherited wealth in Western culture is somehow considered today, not in the past, but today, less legitimate compared to wealth made to, for example, entrepreneurship. Now, I'll be talking about the nobility, which is distinguished, if we look at the sociological definition of nobility, which basically was introduced by the famous sociologist Max Weber, by having formal titles of nobility which are transferred from one generation to the other. But aristocracy is a different concept, which doesn't require formal titles of nobility, but only some sort of privilege, the enjoyment of some sort of privilege. And this is why we can, for example, talk about the development of a wealth aristocracy in the United States in the 19th century during the Gilded Age, right? And this is why there is today a concern about the possible development of a global aristocracy. So people who, across the world, move to attend the same schools, develop similar tastes, play the same, exercise the same sports, have shared experiences. And the problem here is that as aristocracy is defined on privilege, it's also defined by exclusion, because you can't share a privilege too much, too widely, otherwise it's going to be no privilege at all, right? So the problem here is that this might lead to the closing of the top, or if you want, to declining mobility, at least at the very top of society. Now, I don't have time to go into detail about all these things, but these are a couple of things which we have to focus on if we think about this way to become rich, which usually, but not always, has to do with inheriting wealth. Now, if we move to entrepreneurship and innovation, this is the path to affluence that today we think of as the most legitimate, but not in the past. I will tell you later, in the Middle Ages, this was the path to affluence which created the biggest problems. Recognize any of these people? Well, one is very easy. Bill Gates. The others are harder. I very rarely have luck, since that. Very rarely happen that people identify any of these. Anyway, to the top right we have Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the water frame, which was one of the key inventions in the British Industrial Revolution. It was used to produce cotton thread, basically. And it's kind of a good example of how to become wealthy during this phase of exploration of the economy, the first industrial revolution. Then we have, to the left, Francesco Di Marco da Tilly. This is a very nice case. This guy was an Italian merchant from the 14th century. He was made an orphan by the Black Death. His family was of middling groups. He became an orphan because of the Black Death. His parents and his brothers died. He inherited something. He sold everything. And when he was like 16, he moved to Avignon in France, which at the time hosted the court of the Pope, and started trading between France and Italy. And he became an exceptionally successful trader, one of the main merchants of 14th century Europe. And we know everything about this guy because his complete business and personal archive was found at the end of basically hidden at the end of a staircase in his palace in Prato, in Tuscany at the end of the 90s. So we know everything about this guy. I will tell you more later because in his old age he also decided to become a banker, which led to something. The second guy here is Jan Pieter van Koen, who in 1612 became the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company. And usually I take this guy to highlight two things. First, how the beginning of the age of explorations, the beginning of the Atlantic trade also offered many opportunities to become wealthy. And also to highlight kind of the dark side of innovation, right? Because this guy here, even by the very low standards at the time, was treating people in the colonies very poorly. There is this famous episode in the Banda Islands, which were the place of production of the nutmegs, and the indigenous people had an agreement with the Dutch, which the Dutch understood as having a monopoly on the nutmegs, but the natives understood differently. They also wanted to trade with the English, which didn't work for this guy. So the solution was to conquer the Banda Islands, exterminate the population, bring away the survivors, who were moved to Java, Indonesia, and repopulate them with slaves brought from Africa, basically, which were supposed to be easier to conquer. Now, in the book, I also make other examples of this kind of exploitation, or if you want, the kind of dark side. People like Pizarro, who, as you surely know, among many other things, asked for this exceptional ransom when he captured Atahualpa, the emperor of the Inca Empire. It was like 85 cubic meters of gold, if I remember correctly. And of course, somebody who also is connected to the history of Cartagena, if I'm not wrong, Sir Francis Drake, who basically was a pirate, right? And piracy is another way of exploiting the opportunities of the Atlantic trade. And in general, we have that entrepreneurship can also be, also has a dark side. Organized crime is an aspect of it as well. Now, okay. Now, also in the case of entrepreneurship, we have some other problems which we might want to discuss. One is that becoming rich in this way has not been equally easy across history. So we can try and identify phases during which becoming wealthy through innovation, entrepreneurship has been relatively easy. One such phase was the immediate post-Black period, so from the second half of the 14th century. So for about a century, this terrible pandemic opened opportunities for the survivors. Another was the first phase of the opening of the Atlantic trade routes. Then we have the Industrial Revolution. Then we have at least the beginning of the computer and information. But then, this connects this path to affluence or mobility. We have the problem that if we observe the first generations and then the second, third, and fourth generations, there is a difference, because there is a difference between those who made their wealth and those who mostly inherited it. So the point is that new wealth always tends to become old across time. And the point is that we have, in these phases, the establishment of wealth dynasties. And then an open question here, because I say open question because we don't have enough information to answer it totally. But it's important to ask this question. The open question is whether the process of establishment of wealth dynasty, or if you want, the aristocratization of wealth in these phases, in the end, brings these phases of relatively easy enrichment to an end. This seems to have happened at the end of the Industrial Revolution. It seems that, for example, in the continental United States, at the end of the Gilded Age, the group which was at the top was actively trying to keep the newcomers down. Then, of course, in that case, we have that the world wars make everything confused. But, this is a question important to ask, because we might be experiencing this right now without noticing it. Most of the people who became super rich during the computer and information age are pretty old today, people like Bill Gates. And the way in which their companies behave is also to try and prevent newcomers to become too big, so they simply buy them off. So, this is something that on principle could also connect to some human qualities. Now, finally, finance. Finance is very difficult to distinguish from entrepreneurship and, even from trade in a medieval and early modern context, of course. But it's important to try and do that, because this is, across Western history, the path to affluence which has led to the greatest problems and which has been looked at with the greatest suspicion. So I mentioned this guy here, Francesco di Marco Latini, and I told you we know everything about him. Now, when he was pretty old, at the end of the 14th century, he decided he also wanted to open a bank. And then he sent to his business associates his letters telling them, look, I want to open a bank or a bank. What do you think about that? And we have the answers. And his friends were telling me, why in hell do you want to do it? I mean, you are already one of the richest people in Florence and then in Europe at the time. You have a very good name as a merchant. If you become a money changer, a banker, in the words of the period, everybody will think that you're a usurer. I, who am your friend, know that you wouldn't, and you would instead, be a good person, whatever. But they will say there is no way he's not a usurer, because all those who play with money are usurers. But the point was, even if it was entirely acceptable according to the law in that period to be involved in credit, in private credit, this was still considered as a big problem. And this stigma involving finance weakens in history, but it survives in some form until today. Think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, right? Now, I could make you other examples of how to become rich following the path to affluence, like Cosimo de' Medici, we'll mention him later, or Jacob Fugger, he was the banker of the Emperor Charles V. I will mention it to John Pierpont Morgan. I will tell you something more about Grazianasi, because I want to tell you something about at least one woman. And what we have with women is that usually they are, we know that many among them were very much involved in managing the family company, but we usually don't know about that because they are hidden by the surviving documentation. In exceptional cases, like for example that of Francesco di Marco Latini, we know that his wife, Margherita, was basically managing the company when he was, say, in the Low Countries for his work, right? So we know about that, but that's because for entirely exceptional reasons, we know everything about that guy. Now, Grazianasi is a very interesting case, which also allows to highlight an interesting feature of finance. Again, we kind of look down on finance as a way to become wealthy, but for women, it was a relatively open area of activity. In Europe, in pre-industrial Europe, and sometimes also in the 19th century, women had legal constraints to their capacity to act in the economy. In the context of finance, they were freer. Many among them were actually widows, so they became free when they became widows, right? And they could invest their capital. And we know that women were very important in terms of lenders, maybe to an intermediary, but we know that many of them were actually making their real decisions in pretty every European context we know about, or say in the United States in the 19th century, in the early 20s. They were a very substantial part of those providing money, and they controlled a very substantial part of total capital being loaned. Now, Gracia Nasi is a very interesting case. She was born in 1510. She belonged to a family of Marranos, so these were Jews converted to the Christian religion. She was made to marry her uncle, Francisco Mendes, and the Mendes family happened to have been one of the main funders of the Portuguese project to open the trade route to the Indies, the East Indies, by circumnavigating Africa. And by the beginning of the 16th century, the Mendes family, beyond being very important financial players, also controlled a substantial part of the import of pepper to Europe. They were extremely rich. Her husband dies in 1538, and so she becomes a super rich widow. And a Marrana on top. 2 years before, the Portuguese Inquisition had been established. And she perceived the situation as being dangerous, not only because she belonged to a family of converted Jews, but also because she really didn't want to be forced to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. So what she does is leave Lisbon and move to Antwerp to join the brother of her deceased husband, Jogo Mendes. And we know that she helped Jogo to manage the family firm. By the way, Jogo later married her daughter, so the family was very closely knitted together. On top of that, in his will, Jogo established that upon his death, she had to become the manager of the entire Mendes fortune, which she does. So he dies, and she becomes the manager. Problem, however, she's even richer, and again, a widow without any man who could kind of shelter. And the problem here is again Charles V, the emperor, who really wants to ease the marriage between her and a minor member of the House of Aragon, who happened to have promised 100,000 ducats to the emperor in case the matchmaking was successful. So what she does is to flee with subterfuge. She flees first to Aachen, saying that she's going to the terms, and then she goes to Lyon, and then she ends up in Italy, in particular in Ferrara, which at that moment was, for the Jewish community, one of the most open places in Europe. Problem is, there she resumes open practice of the Jewish religion. And that becomes an issue because that was illegal, that was apostasy. You couldn't abandon the Christian religion. Right? And even in Ferrara that was a problem, so she has to flee again. She flees to Istanbul, which in that period was even more open religiously than a place like Ferrara in Italy. And from Istanbul, at the court of the Sultan, she helps Jews escape persecution across Europe using the connections and the money of her family. And again, this is a very interesting case. Of course, it's an exceptional case, but it allows to illuminate, to highlight this other side to finance, right? Now, we can also try to measure in a quantitative way how important these different paths to affluence were. For the pre-industrial period, we can do this only for a few places, actually, like the city of Verona, where we have fiscal records that exceptionally also tell us about the occupation of the people, of the taxpayers. Now, in this case, as we have the complete population, we can also look at what happens if we apply different definition of wealth, like, what happens if we look at the composition of top 5, or top 1, or of those who are above the richness line, so above 10 times the median wealth. which in this case, in this specific case, is an in-between situation in terms of the prevalence between top 5 and top 1. And we see, for example, that in this place finance was almost unimportant, but Verona was not a financial hub. And we have some sign that from the beginning of this period, so 1409 to the beginning of the 17th century, due to the progressive decline of certain manufacturing activities, especially in the textile sector within the city of Verona proper, the prevalence of those practicing, of those becoming wealthy through entrepreneurship and trade was declining. Anyway, we can do this exercise for some communities and places. When we get into the modern period, we have to rely on the so-called rich list, right? Like the Forbes list of billionaires of today. For the previous period, and in particular for Britain and the United States, we have some other rich lists. I will show you the case of the United States, highlighting a couple of things. First, if you look at the richest Americans, and by the way, these are very small percentage of it. So in this case, we are looking at the top 0.001% to 0.0001%. So it's really the top of the top. And what you see here, where is interesting, you see the decline from those born before 1830 to those born at the beginning of the 20th century, of those who had, or those whose wealth was basically connected to land and real estate. So at the beginning of the period, this is the old wealth coming from the colonial period, basically. At the same time, we observe an increase in those whose wealth comes from industry and business, and to some degree from finance. Importantly, we also have some indication about the prevalence of those who were first generation wealth. And this declines across the period, and particularly important what happens during the Gilded Age, right? So we see exactly what I was discussing before, the aristocratization of wealth in the American Gilded Age. Which means, again, that most of these people who might have really wanted to present themselves as people who had earned their position actually had inherited it. Now, to be quick, if we move into the 21st century, we can look at the rich across the West. The percentage of population, these are the billionaires according to the billionaires in dollars, in US dollars, according to Forbes. The percentage is about the same, so it top 0.001 to 0.0001% of the Western population. And we see a number of interesting things. One is that finance today is much more important in terms of how many people became rich through it than at any previous point in history. And as I mentioned, this is only the very top, but we have some confirmation of this from other sources which tell us something about the lower groups, right? If we look at the rich defined in a broader sense, like the top 1 to 5, we continue to see that finance today really is much more important as a path to affluence, which can be a problem because there continues to be some sort of a stigma against those who made their money by using money. Those who inherited wealth are about, in the most recent years, 1/3 of the total, which is substantial. And we also know the prevalence of women within this very elite. Now, if we look at the data about women, if we try hard, very hard, we could look at the glass as being half full, because it almost doubles between 2001 and 2021. But if you consider that 13.7% is not even half those who inherited their wealth, it's pretty clear that there continues to be a substantial discrimination against women, at least at this very high level. It's not them, in many settings, who inherit, right? They are not preferred. They are disadvantaged compared to sons in many contexts. And of course, there is only so much we can do with this kind of data. Unfortunately, and this is an interesting feature of modern societies, as most countries do not systematically tax wealth, we know less about the wealthy today than about the wealth in the pre-industrial context, when wealth was the main item of taxation. We know much more about the incomes of modern people compared to the pre-industrial people, but we also know much less about the wealth of modern people compared to the pre-industrial people. That's really, and this actually depends on how fiscal systems are structured, which shapes how documentation is produced, the information is produced. Now, if we look a bit more about inherited wealth, the problem is that based on current estimates, we see exactly the same pattern which I described for wealth concentration. A decline in the prevalence of inherited wealth from the beginning of World War I, which was also due to the destruction of wealth caused by the world wars, both physical destruction of wealth in the European context, especially in World War II, the destruction of financial capital, also due to war hyperinflation from the beginning of World War I and in the war period and so on. But also here, this was the consequence of sometimes very aggressive policies against inherited wealth. And by the way, this was an effort which was relatively bipartisan in its context. In the United Kingdom, a conservative politician like Winston Churchill said that it was important to tax inheritance in order to get rid of a class of idle rich. And he said we have to do this to protect capitalism. And the problem was we have to protect capitalism from socialism. So there was an ideological competition which also kind of fostered this attempt, right? So here it's not only the destruction of wealth, it's also fiscal redistribution to substantial degree. And then we have the inversion, and the problem today is that inherited wealth has become, again, a very important and growing part of private wealth, which is one of the points that people like Martin Petit highlight as being potentially a problem for the future. How much time I have left? Okay. Now, I try to be very quick about this final. What about the presence of the super rich in particular in society? Now, I usually read these two texts and ask people if they can identify who they are. I will not today, for reasons of time. Both of these people talk about democracies, and both of them argue that in a democratic context, if you have super rich individuals, you can't expect them to act as the others. So the point is, institutions will not work in practice in a way which gives everybody equal rights. The problem is, the first guy is Nicolas Oresme, writing in the 14th century, translating and adapting Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who already had similar concepts. And he basically says, in a city governed democratically, you should punish the wealthy, otherwise they will be as gods among men. You can't expect them, you can't expect a democracy to function. Of course, it was thinking about very small republics like city-state, right? And he even argued that if you really wanted to live in a democracy, maybe you should have introduced good laws to prevent people from inheriting beyond a certain amount, like 100% inheritance tax above a certain level. The other guy, of course, is Piketty, who argues that, again, if wealth concentration becomes high, you can't expect democracy to function according to the principles that they, in theory, should put forward. Now, this has to do with one specific problem, the political activity of the super rich, which has always been considered a problem in Western history. But the presence of very wealthy people in society is a much more general problem. So in the Middle Ages, theologians argued that if you were a wealthy commoner, not if you are a noble, because if you were a noble, you had inherited your wealth, and you, in theory at least, managed it to the benefit also of your subjects, right? In the context of the feudal system, you were expected to give something to your subjects in terms, for example, of protection, health, in certain context. But more importantly, you had your wealth because that followed those plans. But what about the commoners? If you're a commoner and very wealthy, why were you wealthy? If you could have used your wealth to help the poor, why were you accumulating it? So for people like Thomas Aquinas, that wasn't any middle ground. If you are a wealthy commoner, you are a sinner, and your sin was avarice or greed, which is a very important sin, of course. And he went to the point of advising rulers to prevent their subjects from becoming involved in international trade, otherwise they would have become too rich and that would have been polluting for society. Of course, the rulers didn't listen to him, right? He was discussing this issue precisely because the problem was arising, and it was arising from the commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th century, when certain places in Europe, many among them in Italy actually, started to expand international trade by using sea routes, beginning with the Mediterranean area and then integrating the Baltic area. Earlier phase compared to the beginning of the Atlantic. So he was observing the growing wealth of these commoners and he was condemning, but the process couldn't be stopped. To the point that by the end of the 15th century, as the presence of these very wealthy individuals could not be ignored, the reflection of wealth started to change, and in some functions, some roles to play for the rich were identified. So for people like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the rich had no place in a well-organized Christian society. The commoner rich. In the 15th century instead, and I'll make you Italian examples, but Italy was really, in the context of Europe, one of the places where the problem was arising. Humanists like Poggio Bracciolini at the beginning of the 15th century were arguing that the rich did play an important role, and basically they were like private partners of money. And he was saying, like, cities well organized, established public granaries to provide food in times of famine or crisis. We can't rely upon the rich during crisis to provide us with money. And the point is, during the crisis, will you ask the poor for help? They will not be able to help because they don't have anything to give. If we need money, they will not be able to help us. But the rich will be able to, willing or not. So an important thing here is that the simple fact of having the rich will allow, during a crisis, the community to ask them kindly to help, maybe to provide loans. If they don't want to provide loans, they will be forced to provide loans or they'll be taxed. So it's not really a voluntary thing. And this is something that, by finding a role to play for the rich, so helping the communities in times of crisis, gives them an important role to play in society. The other function identified for the rich was that of magnificence. And this is an idea that the Italian Renaissance takes straight from classical antiquity. Magnificence means to do great deeds. And this guy here, Giovanni Pontano, at the end of the 15th century says, in our age, from the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder, was the first to revive the classical tradition of magnificence, which means changing private wealth into a public benefit. And the point here is that, even simply by building the palaces and villas, for example, these rich people are making the city splendid to the benefit of everybody, because you will enjoy aesthetically the palaces, those who come to your city will like it. When we go and visit an ancient city and we stroll along the roads and observe these palaces, we still enjoy them, so there is some merit in this idea. Even more if those people instead use their money, for example, to establish public libraries or to endow institutions like monasteries or institutions to help the poor and so forth and so on. Now, we mentioned explicitly Cosimo de' Medici. The point is, was Cosimo de' Medici magnificent? Well, simply based on what is left of the buildings he established and built, both his private buildings, but for example, he also established the first part of the Medici Library, which is considered to have been the first public library in Renaissance Europe. So he was magnificent. We still can, enjoy these places, which are usually museums today. But there is a but. So Cosimo is a very interesting case because he performed both the functions given to the rich. In 1433, he was exiled by his political enemies in Florence, which was a republic at the time, charged with intending to rise above the other citizens. And this means, intending to put an end to the republic in fact. But the following year, as Florence had lost a war against Pisa, another small city, as they lost the war, they couldn't repay their war debt with the spoils of war, they called Cosimo back to help them, and at the same time they exiled the political enemies of Cosimo. So they called him back and asked him if he could kindly save the city from financial ruin, which he does by telling his bank to pay the loan of the city. So first function, help your community in times of crisis. Second function, from that moment on, he intensifies his magnificence. He endows monasteries, he builds villas, he establishes the library. But magnificence, again, doing great deeds, is not munificence, which means making gifts. It's not a gift, because this was clear, it was very clear to all the Florentine people in the time that by doing this, Cosimo was also making a very explicit claim, the claim to have a right to rule. In fact, 1434 is also considered the moment when the Medici family in Florence begins the so-called crypto-signory or hidden signory, which later will become formal signory, will become the Dukes of Florence. But from this moment, they are basically the ruler of what in theory is a republic, but in practice is ever more different from a republic. And that's the problem with magnificence, which also connects to current concerns about what we today would call philanthropy. But philanthropy and giving, philanthropy in particular is a late 18th century concept. And philanthropy, to really be philanthropy, requires that nothing is given in exchange, not even simple influence. So the point here is that maybe some of what we tend to call philanthropy actually is magnificence. It would be better to call it magnificence because at least it's clear what's the bargain. Okay. Again, complex topic which I don't have the time to develop. Juliana stopped me when I told too much. Okay? I will skip the early modern period, which pains me. Now, main function of the rich, help their communities in times of crisis. The last case in which I could mention one super rich individual who saves his city from financial ruin is that of J.P. Morgan during the bank crisis of 1907. The famous story is that, faced with the risk of a run on banks, at the end of the weekend, he calls to his private library in New York, which by the way today is a museum, so magnificent. A group of financiers from New York, and he tells them, then he locks everybody in and tells those who are there, we are not getting out of here until we have found a solution to the problem. So it's not only mobilizing his own capital, but also his connections. And when they get out of the library, they coordinate their action to restore faith in the solvability of the financial system, preventing a run on banks. And J.P. Morgan, at that moment, is hailed by his fellow citizens as the savior of the countries, with words which are very similar to those used by the Florentines to welcome Cosimo de' Medici back to Florence in 1430. Problem is, this was a modern democracy. So this display of financial power in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century also fuels the concerns of the time about the so-called money trust. So this group, very small group of extremely rich individuals who supposedly control the finances and the economy of the country, and that many risk, and this was a bipartisan worry, many fears, sorry, with a bipartisan worry, they might also try to control the politics. And, this is one episode which fuels this concern. This leads to the establishment of a committee, the Peugeot Committee, to investigate the money trust. This leads to the establishment, I think in 1912, of the Fed system, which was aimed explicitly at preventing the country from having ever again to rely upon the goodwill of the rich to be saved from financial. At the same time, this becomes one additional motivation of the strengthening of antitrust legislation. Right? And this taps into that kind of deconcentration of wealth which we see in the United States and in other Western countries which follow the model of the United States regarding, for example, antitrust law. And this political concern, again, kind of fuels that process. Now, to end with the very recent theme. What happens then during recent crises? Now, beginning with the Great Recession of 2008, then in Europe the sovereign debt crisis of 2010-11, then the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen across the West repeatedly that people were asking for making the rich help more. In terms of fiscal innovation, this didn't lead to too much, because we have surveys of fiscal reform across Western countries that show that very little was made in terms, for example, of introducing more progressive taxation or even adopt taxes of the rich, even in a temporary manner. And the net result of this is that if we compare the two last great financial crises, right, not the two last great, so these two great financial crises, the Great Recession of the 1930s, beginning with the 1929 stock market crash of Wall Street, and then the 2008 Great Recession triggered by the financial crisis at the end of 2007, we observed after the first a decline in the wealth share of the richest, but not after the second. So the problem is the wealth of the richest seems to have become ever more resilient to crises. But that resilience is also built on having avoided being made to help the communities in times of crisis. Now, this is not something that requires that all the rich and super rich are in agreement about trying to avoid being taxed. It's simply what comes from a prevalent, say, tendency, right? The point is, again, notwithstanding all these crises which provided all these good opportunities to make the rich perform their traditional social role, nothing happened. So they are not performing anymore this traditional social role. But that was what gave the rich a role to play in society at the end of the Middle Ages. And I would argue this is still an expectation we have, so they are no longer fulfilling this expectation, with potentially concerns in terms of social stability, in terms of future resilience against crises, and so forth and so on. I could develop this much more, but I told too much, and I will stop here with anticipation of the cover of the future Spanish edition of the book, which will appear in October. Thank you. I talked too much. I apologize. 27 de octubre. Creo que sí.
Muchísimas gracias, Guido. No, creo que me estaban diciendo que no te detuviera, que te dejara hablar porque estaban muy interesados en la conversación. Entonces, gracias. No sé si tenemos preguntas. Yo tengo unas cuantas, pero...
Una curiosidad más que pregunta. O sea, hablamos de la concentración de esos ingresos, pero la torta es mayor en uno que en otro. O sea, y el tamaño importa también, porque en unos casos, me imagino, durante la revolución industrial el crecimiento económico fue muy grande, o sea, ya había mucho más. ¿Hay alguna manera de controlar, o sea, qué tanto que quiero? O sea, porque la discusión está, bueno, importan los súper ricos para que la torta crezca. O sea, de todas maneras, el desarrollo, el crecimiento también importa, por ejemplo, en un país como Colombia, donde no somos un país rico y importante, pero hasta qué punto. Y lo otro pensaba, bueno, uno es sobre el tamaño, otro sobre qué tanto esa concentración, digamos, cuando comienza a ser un problema. Que ha habido algunos estudios que pudieran pensarse hasta dónde debe llegar esto, o sea, porque pues, de todas maneras eso, detrás de esa concentración hay un crecimiento económico y dónde puede llegar a ser un problema. Y tercero, ya para no decir, la movilidad social, o sea, digamos, si pudiste ver algo sobre qué tanto hay movilidad social a través de todos esos miles de años que han.
Okay, can I answer in English? Yeah. I'll begin with the last point, the social mobility question. So, based on what we know, and in this case, for the pre-industrial period, most of the data comes from another project of mine, and we are still kind of cleaning and publishing the data. But those phases during which we have relatively easy enrichment, for example, innovation, are also phases in which we find traces of relatively easy upward mobility. One is the immediate post-elected period, when really we find a boost to the possibility of moving across society in a context which was relatively immobile, usually. Another is the beginning of the 16th century. We have the industrial revolutions and so on. But also we see systematically that these boosts then tend to decline, and that connects to what I was defining as the worry about the development of wealth dynasties. So the question is that decline in mobility at the end of these phases of explorations also the consequence of aristocratization of new wealth, so new wealth becoming old wealth, and then those at the top trying to define their privilege and then preventing the others from rising above. So from this point of view, I would say that this effort to try and identify phases during which becoming rich has been easier because of opportunities also seems to connect very well to these attempts at measuring in a quantitative way social mobility. And I mean, for now, and that's still provisional, the two things kind of match, seem to match very, very well, although we can quantify social mobility in a much easier way, still very difficult, by the way, compared to what we can do in terms of exploring how easy it was to follow a specific path, because the kind of information we need is different. Now, going back to the other questions you asked me, trying to remember everything. The problem with the actual access to resources is connects to the usual debate about whether we should look at how people live and at how wealth, in this case, or income and others, is distributed, right? So the point is, in some societies of today, almost everybody is wealthy compared to people living, say, 1,000 years ago, is valid if you mean only access to physical resources. But the point I would make, and this is also kind of the general point one makes when working on inequality, is that the distribution still matters. Because based on the kind of relative definitions of wealth which I provided, you will always have wealthy and poor people in society, unless you really think about a society which is a perfectly egalitarian one, never existed in this. So the point is, the rich, from this point of view, can't exist without the poor. Sort of, because you could also have, very big middling groups, nobody below a certain level. In practice, the point is, the rich move in tandem with the poor. I showed you the prevalence of the rich. If I showed you the prevalence of the poor, defined, for example, as those below 1/4 of the median, they also increase in the same period. So it's really kind of a social polarization, and the point is the middling groups are empty in the early modern Europe, which is a very interesting dynamic which we still have to think through in terms of its implications. So the point is, again, that without negating, of course, the fact that most of us today live at much better conditions compared to the past, but the point is that the existence of the rich continues to be a reality. The rich defined as those with way more resources compared to others. Now, is this a problem? Something on which the Western tradition is homogeneously in agreement is that if you have super rich individuals in a democracy, super rich individuals who want to become involved in politics, that's a problem. And the problem is the political involvement of the super rich has become more intense in the 1990s on. A pioneer in that was Silvio Berlusconi, who when he became the Prime Minister of Italy in 1994, for the first time, I think he was the 22nd or something richest person in the world, according to Forbes. And by the way, he was also the kind of entrepreneur who was focusing on the media, so it's an extra layer. There is a debate about the influence of super rich donors in the ongoing American elections. Even if you don't want to go there in terms of discussion, the point is today in the West there seems to be a much greater acceptance of this kind of political involvement of the super rich compared to the past. And I would argue that people like Berlusconi or another billionaire like Donald Trump, they would have never been elected to a public post in the 1960s, I think. Because the preferences of the individuals were much more against the rich trying to control politics. So something changed. The beginning of the 20th century in the United States is very clearly a phase during which there was a bipartisan worry about wealth taking over politics. Where did that worry go? It's not disappeared, but it has weakened a lot. And this might become a problem. I mean, if politics become captured by wealth, that's a problem. What's the threshold? I would say nobody knows. And we don't really want to run the experiment by that. Right? I mean, when does a democracy stop being practiced a democracy? We don't know. I mean, we could make cases, right? We could make cases. We could make the case of Florence in the 15th century, that's clear. You call Cosimo de' Medici back to save the city from financial ruin, he basically buys the city. Buys the state. That's clear, but how do you apply this to other societies? It's kind of impossible to say. It's still important to ask the question because this might be something we have to work out. The other point is about the incentive, and that's a general issue, right? So the point is, if we look at inequality in human societies, I would say there is a general agreement about the fact that when societies become more complex and also able to achieve more, beginning with prehistory and then pre-societies and so forth and so on, we also find evidence of an increase in inequality in terms of access. And the general agreement is that some inequality is needed to provide an incentive, otherwise why should you want to put the extra effort if you are going to get exactly what the others are getting in? What nobody knows is how much inequality we need to get the full benefit from this incentive. But the general impression is that the level of inequality in principle is not very good. So we are already above that. And there are many worldviews, although then the question becomes complicated because there is a debate about the data used to make discussion. But many would argue that there is no evidence whatsoever that if you look at the different trends in inequality between different parts of rich countries, continents, and so on, there doesn't seem to be really a trade-off in economic growth. So inequality, so growth was similar in countries which experienced a very different dynamic in terms of inequality growth. And for the pre-industrial period, the point is, and I did a lot of work on this, that we find that really economic growth is not the only or even the main factor pushing inequality up in the pre-industrial context, because we find this tendency for inequality to grow in early modern times, both in stagnating and declining areas and in areas which are growing economically. So it's surely a factor that in certain contexts, like for example, the Dutch Republic during the 17th century golden age, tends to favor inequality growth, but in other places, there are other factors which point in the same direction. For example, but we'll only mention these unless you want to develop this, there is the development of so-called the rise of the fiscal state, so the increasing taxation mostly to fund war from the 16th century on, in a context in which taxation was regressive by construction, so the rich were paid proportionally less than the poor, were taxed proportionally less than the poor, right? So you have in this context an increasing per capita taxation that's bound to produce inequality everywhere, both in growing and declining countries, because both of them have to tax more in order to be able to defend themselves, let alone projecting power to war beyond their bounds. And this is something I researched in some detail. And that's independent. So there are other factors which are also independent of growth, which I think in general weakens the idea that inequality growth or concentration of wealth has to be viewed as an unpleasant side effect of something positive like, for example, economic development. Historically, there are many reasons to argue against.
Buenos días, profesor Alfani, muchas gracias por la presentación, muy interesante. A uno le surgen un montón de preguntas de la presentación. Una digamos, de la última parte que, si podría por favor elaborar un poco más, es sobre el tema de la resiliencia, de por qué esa desigualdad se resiste un poco más a disminuir. Yo no estoy completamente seguro, por ejemplo, en el gráfico porque uno lo ha notado de otras lecturas donde dicen, y como lo mencionaba el profesor Alfani al principio, las guerras, las catástrofes, las pandemias son una de las causas en donde uno observa que la desigualdad efectivamente cae. Yo no estoy seguro, digamos, si en el caso de las crisis financieras pareciera, aquí como no estamos comparando eso, de pronto pareciera que con las crisis financieras no se redujera tanto como con las guerras, como veíamos al principio de la Primera y Segunda Guerra Mundial. Pues un poco, digamos, no sé, profesor, qué opinión tiene, porque ahorita se mencionaban sobre las posibles causas de esa resiliencia a la política. Puede ser una, la complejidad en la organización social, como también nos mencionaba, o no sé si últimamente, digamos, el tema de la digitalización. Estamos en una era digital. Eso, y de pronto amarrado a eso también, profesor Alfani, ¿cómo nos ve en adelante? Yo no sé, 50 años parecen poco de acuerdo a todo lo que observamos, porque eso se demora bastante en caer, como vimos. Tal vez en 100 años o en 200 años, porque yo siento, digamos, que la humanidad siempre busca una manera de que las cosas vayan bien. Cuando la desigualdad estaba muy alta, pasa una guerra, una catástrofe, una hambruna, una pandemia, y como que regresamos nuevamente. No sé cómo lo ve usted en el futuro, no sé.
No, many thanks. In English, because the answer is complicated. So, there is of course an issue with scale, right? Because when we think about first of all, there is an issue with scale when we think about the equalizing impact of catastrophes, right? Because those which in history appear to really have reduced inequality, if you want to focus only on catastrophes, a really large scale, like the Black Death across Europe, the period of the 30 Years' War plus plague in Germany in the 17th century, or the world wars. That being said, the extent, in terms of extent of financial and economic crisis, the gradient is much smaller if you compare the Greek recession and the Greek depression. They are much closer together in terms of intensity compared to, say, COVID-19 and the Black Death. Of course, really entirely different. Which is why in this graph it's particularly important to point at that, right? The beginning of the financial crisis, then triggering the economic crisis. For the 21st century, however, it's also interesting that we have a sequence of crises. In some countries, this is more clear. For example, my country, as we were lucky enough to also have big time the sovereign debt crisis, we really had a long phase of economic crisis, almost getting into COVID-19. And COVID-19, by the way, from one point of view, is comparable to major crises of the past, and that's how much money we spent to manage. And money is key. Because in managing previous crises, including those of the first half of the 20th century, Western societies tapped clearly and in a very specific way into the resources of the rich. I mean, if you consider Roosevelt's New Deal, it was basically explicitly saying we are asking the richest to contribute to pay the bill of the crisis, also because we believe them to be the culprits, right? Which maybe they were, but in 2007, we know the financial system, especially in the US, that this kind of spread globally was the culprit, right? Although of all the people who went to jail, I think like 95% of them were from Iceland. Many people were punished substantially for this, but we know that there was a responsibility of finance in triggering the crisis. So the point is, why in this period the richest were asked to contribute more than in this period, and then again, yeah, you can really consider the whole period from end of 2007 till today, basically. Why here, fiscal reform went in a direction of explicitly making the richest pay the bill of the crisis, and here this did not happen? And that's a big question. Now, I don't think it's like the preferences of the general population, because from Occupy Wall Street till today, in pretty much every country in the West there has been the request. So, okay, no, let's make the rich pay more. There is, of course, an issue with context, right, which I think also you were mentioning. Because capital was much less mobile in this phase than in that phase. So a possible answer to this is, okay, people were asking their governments to collect more resources from the top, but the governments couldn't because they knew that capital would have fled. Apart from the fact that we don't know whether that would happen in general, and there is a debate about this. The point is also the following. What is really striking, if you look at these surveys of fiscal reform, and there are many of them which can be compared, so we have a good coverage across OECD countries, basically. Almost nobody, with the very partial exception of Spain, in fact, almost nobody introduced even temporary measures to make the rich contribute more to the crisis. And the point I would make is the following. Imagine in the hit of COVID-19 in countries which were badly affected, like my country. Europe was one of those affected first and worst by the crisis. Imagine the Prime Minister going on TV, all channels together, and saying, okay, this is going to cost, we are facing something unexpected, a huge crisis. This is going to cost a lot of money. We kindly ask the richest to contribute more in a temporary manner. So like from 1 year, for 2 years, for this amount, and for this reason. Now, made in that way, so as a temporary measure explicitly to take on that issue, First, I don't think that many among the rich would have avoided that kind of thing. I think they would have felt like a commitment to help. And second, if they had fled from that, social sanction would have been huge. So that's the point I would make. Not even temporary measures were introduced. And that's telling. So I think this suggests that politics are possibly captured by wealth, to some degree at least. These prevented these reforms from becoming, law. We don't have the smoking gun, but that's pretty much, that's a worrying suspicion. Now, what did the countries do instead? During COVID, which was extremely expensive, they increased public debt. And who's going to pay that public debt? In a context in which in many countries, including again my country, there is a pressure to go towards flatter and flatter taxation, right? So it's like you hide the problem below the carpet, but in the end it's not going to be the rich to pay the bill. No more than the rest of society, at least, proportionally to the resources. So that's also kind of the problem. So the fact is, this resilience acquired by the patrimonies of the top, and by the way, I use the word resilience here because, for example, let me go back. For example, I discuss in other works, and also in the book, the resilience of the patrimonies of the rich against the plagues of the 17th century. Now, forget about Germany, which also has the 30 Years' War, but the point is, Italy in the 17th century is affected by the worst plagues after the Black Death. And the mortality rates for the Black Death, they are usually thought to be about 50% of the population. For the 17th century plague, like the one which in 1630 affects the center north, well, more the north than the center, mortality rates have been estimated by me, by the way, to be about 35%. So, but you don't see anything here. You don't see any sign of an equality reduction. You really have to look closely at the data to see a very temporary impact. And the point is that while the Black Death was an unexpected event and it took everybody, including the rich, by surprise, the 17th century plagues occur in a society which already knows that this kind of event can happen. And so all the patrimonies of the richest families had been protected by institutions like the commissum of the mayorazgo in the Spanish context, which were also aimed at preventing the kind of patrimonial fragmentation which had happened after that death. Right? So that's resilience, right? In this case, it's a resilience which interestingly prevents the same boost to social mobility which we find after the Black Death from happening again. We can measure that impact, by the way. We can measure mobility, and we see a peak much lower and much more short-lived compared to after the Black Death. So it's really something that we can observe. So resilience is tricky. And if we think about this idea of resilience of the patrimony of the rich in today's context, the resilience of their patrimony to the current crisis, you could think, okay, good for them. Yeah, but it's also obtained, again, by something, in a way which might actually reduce overall societal resilience to crisis, because it makes funding reaction to the crisis more difficult. So it's like you increase private resilience to the crisis at the top, and you reduce public collective resilience at the same time. Again, this is something that should be explored more, but that's kind of an impression that you can clearly get, and I think that we have much to say about that. Final point you made about the future. I think that the current trends are going to continue. So we are not even close to observing a change in how these different developments take place. The problem is which will be the level of inequality and or the level of capture of politics by wealth, after which we have an inversion of the trend. difficult to say. Even more important question, will the inversion of the trend, which I think would happen at some point, will that be something which happens peacefully, right, in a societal meaning? Also unclear, because if we look at history, of course, in this case, luckily enough, there are different societies, but if we look at history, every time the rich have been perceived to be unsensitive to the price of the masses, then we had episodes of violence addressed against them, large scale social instability, even revolution in some cases. It would be preferable not to go there, right? But, who knows?
Bueno, primero, muchísimas gracias, felicidades por la conferencia. Tengo dos preguntas. La primera es acerca del cambio de perspectiva que se tiene hacia los ricos a partir de la Edad Media, moderna y contemporánea. Es si el aumento de la calidad de vida no ha tenido una influencia, o si ha tenido una influencia en este cambio de perspectivas en la gente de no deseable a deseable, por observarlo como alcanzable, teniendo en cuenta el aumento de la clase media y del poder adquisitivo en promedio de las poblaciones europeas. Y la segunda pregunta es acerca de los comerciantes de mediano alcance o figuras de mediano alcance económico que tal vez en comparación a los más ricos de Europa, principalmente en la Edad Media y en la Edad Moderna, pero sí en su lugar, en la localidad en la que trabaja, a comparación de la población en promedio, sí se podría considerar rico, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué hay de esas figuras de mediano alcance que tal vez no llegaron a ser los más ricos de todo el reino, uno de los más ricos de todo el reino, pero en la localidad sí alcanzaron una diferencia más que visible en términos de riqueza? Entonces, ¿qué hay de esos? ¿Qué podrías decir sobre ellos?
Okay. So the first question, alcance means?
Scope. Like what's the scope?
Good.
Scope.
I'm not sure. Maybe I will ask you to ask the second question in English, because I'm not sure I got it precisely.
The second question, I can translate it to you now,
Okay.
if you want. It's about like the middle ground people in trade that are not gonna be the richest, that are not gonna be in the top, but that are gonna be able to climb their social position
Okay.
and will be rich in their town, but not like
Okay.
in the country.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, there are limitations in my Spanish. So, regarding the first question, it's actually a very important question. Now, let me begin the answer by looking at the past, okay? Now, when we look at a case like this one, the Republic of Venice in the early modern period, right? And we look at this growing concentration of wealth, monotonically growing from 1450 to 1800. What does this tell us about actual living conditions of the poor? Right? If we look at the wealth share of the poor, it's declining. So we can measure poverty, the intensity of poverty in different ways, and we find it growing at the same time. But what is a poor in the 16th or 17th century? It's actually somebody who lives close to subsistence, not really maybe physical subsistence, but a level of social subsistence which is not much above physical subsistence. So, when we observe the decline in the wealth share of the poor, does that tell us much in this context about how they are living in practice? No, because they are still going to get enough to survive. Because if they aren't, they would rebel, right? That's the point. A society in which people actually are starving in normal times, not during a famine or whatever, is never in history a stable society. Now, the Republic of Venice stands out in this period for being exceptionally stable from a social point of view. So what happens here is that you have the formal ownership of lands and of economic resources becomes ever more concentrated. But at the same time, you have an increase in resources redistributed from the top to the bottom by means of charity organized by institutions called scuole in this specific context. They were confraternities, basically, which organized private charity. So it's very difficult to estimate the amount of private charity in this period. Nobody did it, that would be kind of its own project, but it's very increased. So you have wealth inequality growing redistribution on a voluntary basis from the top to the bottom, and situation of the poor not changing in practice. They're still a subsistence. They're guaranteed the minimum. What changes, however, is that they're getting the minimum ever more depending on the goodwill of the rich. So this society is becoming nastier towards its members, so-called, right? And more depending on what these people decide to do. And of course, it is a merchant republic, so there is not even an issue about politics here. These are the exceptions in the story. The Venetian Republic, the Dutch Republic, they are republics. But patrician republics, merchant republics, the people who are concentrating the political power are by construction, by definition, the people who are concentrating economic power, right? And these are very interesting places to study, by the way, which also tell us about where we do not want to go today, right? We don't want our democracies becoming something like that, which is really an oligarchic government in which everything is controlled by a wealth oligarchy. Now, what happens in periods closer to ours? One of the arguments often made to counter the idea that growing inequality might be a social issue is that in the end, if everybody is actually enjoying an improvement in their condition, why should we work? Now, I don't think that answers the problem because, if I can afford a car while my grandfather could afford only a bicycle, I might be happy, but what if my neighbor can buy a plane? I'm looking at my neighbor who lives there. I can see how he lives. I'm not thinking about my grandfather. So the point is, there are people like, for example, Branco Milano, which also argue that, tell this like an economist, inequality is kind of part of the utility function of people. So we have a preference for equality. If inequality grows, we tend to be inaccurate, right? Because we observe it. But still, in phases during which the conditions of the bottom strata improve, then this argument can be made, and that's something to be taken seriously, right? Then the question becomes whether that improvement across the board is obtained or not by means of inequality. So whether by allowing inequality to grow, we have produced that effect or not, and that's something which can be debated. But in the most recent period, in many settings, the fact is that the growth of the share of wealth and of income at the top has happened without the bottom or the middle experiencing a substantial improvement in that position. Now, the middling groups, or if you want, the middle class across the West in particular, has experienced this in a bad way, because the middle class is an ambitious class. It's a class which is used not to perceive itself as being very far from. And that's a problem because there is also an aspiration in the middle class to be able to mirror, to some degree, the consumption of the top. When they stop being able to do that, they might become indebted, as it happened in the United States before the Great Recession. Part of the story was the middle class was becoming indebted because they wanted to increase their consumption because somebody at a higher level was doing it. Or, if they don't do that, they will perceive a phase of decline in the crisis of their position, which is why in actually all the Western countries I can think of, today the middle class seems to be going to a crisis, which is a crisis also in its self-assurance. So the middle groups are those who really are more aware of a possible problem, compared to the bottom that in many settings, and at least those which have a well-developed welfare state, are still given something, and sometimes an increasing amount. But there's the middle groups, which fear more this growing distance between the top and all the rest. Did I answer your questions? Okay.
Hola, yo tengo dos preguntas. La primera es sobre la magnificencia que mencionaste. Yo creo que ya se construye cada vez menos grandes construcciones magníficas e increíbles como se hacían antes. ¿Por qué crees que es eso si ha aumentado la desigualdad y la cantidad de riquezas en unos pocos? Porque hay menos magnificencia. Y segundo es sobre lo que viste de la resiliencia. Cada vez los estados crean más redes de seguridad para los estados financieros. ¿Tú crees que eso ayuda a la resiliencia de las riquezas de los más ricos?
Pregunta, por favor.
Cada vez los estados crean redes de seguridad para los sistemas financieros y económicos. ¿Tú crees que esto apoya las resiliencias de las riquezas de los más ricos?
Okay. Entendí. Beginning with the second question. And this is kind of a paradox in history. You know, I was mentioning the case of JP Morgan in 1907, and I was telling you that the establishment of the Federal Reserve System was also a reaction to that. And the point was, okay, we don't want to have to rely upon these super rich people or the money trust to save us. And this was done with the intention of strengthening democracy. The problem is, in this moment, by taking away this duty from the super rich, you were probably increasing the resilience of the public against financial crisis, but at the same time we were building the conditions for increasing the resilience of their patrimonies across time. In the immediate moment, so the beginning of the 20th century, that was compensated by the strong development of very progressive taxation of inheritance as well, and the income. So the impact was different because we were doing the two things at the same time. But if you move to today, when progressivity has reduced a lot, taxation is less intense, in particular taxation of inheritances is at historically very, very, very low levels, and there is also a strong ideological position against it, then the super rich are actually benefiting from the web of resilience which starts to be built at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's not their fault, of course, right? It's not that the problem. The problem is more that there is no longer this drive to tap into their resources during the crisis. So they're no longer contributing in basically any way which is not simple charitable good. Now about magnificence, if I understood correctly the question. Magnificence, I mean, in the historical tradition, in the end of the 19th century was considered in a positive way. You have a very wealthy individual who decides to do something to the benefit of the collective. If the person is doing that with his or her private money, what's the problem there? The only problem is arising when you start presenting magnificence as philanthropy. Because again, magnificence, to do great deeds, is something which has a political content. If you do magnificence and reap the political benefit, but at the same time you tell us that you aren't doing this, you are only doing this out of, your philanthropic feelings, first, you are increasing the degree of hypothesis in the system, and second, why are you hiding your explicit attempt at building influence? And that's the big problem, right? Because the way in which I look at this long-run historical development is that there are very strong continuities, but also changes in the intensity in which certain things are perceived. So it's not like we see the world as people in the 16th century were seeing the world, of course. We kind of think differently. But still we are faced sometimes with very much the same problems, and some kind of basic ideas are still there. So the point is, magnificence as a concept is more honest. It makes the bargain clear. And do we want to take the bargain or not? At least we know what's the bargain. As opposed to having people who, tell us, okay, we are doing this simply out of generosity, pure and simple, without getting anything back, while in fact they're also getting something back, which is the possibility to exert pressure on politicians, for example, to steer them away from increasing taxation. And the whole argument that sometimes is made, for example, by many American super rich, that by paying less taxes, they are more able to do charity, philanthropy, so forth and so on, I think is fatally flawed. Because that's not the point. Right? The point is, to me, is the social contact. So the fact that the rich commoners were given legitimacy in society at the end of the Middle Ages establishes a social, the way in which that is done, establishes a social contract which hasn't changed. But a part of society is no longer apparently sticky to the side of the contract. And the consequences of this, are difficult to foretell, but that they might not be good for any of the parties.
Tenemos dos preguntas más, entonces voy a pasar la palabra acá.
First one, great presentation, was amazing. My question is about the richest people. If the financial of the city or save the ring of the city was an strategy for stealing the power in the future.
Okay. So I think that this is, for example, what the case of Florence, which I mentioned, shows very clearly. In a medieval context, which is a context in which these political systems are really small scale, right? We're not talking about big states, we're talking about what are mostly city-states, a little bit larger. I think that there is a risk which people like Poggio Bracciolini were not getting in asking the rich to help in that way. And the risk is when the help is very substantial, then that can also be used to build political power. Right? And that's what the Medici do. And that's exactly the kind of worry the United States experienced after 1907, the fact of having to rely on the resources of JP Morgan shows that the guy is actually controlling a lot of what's happening in the state, and that might be too far. So in general, I would say yes, but it's also true that in the context of the more normal crisis and periods, the help asked to the richer strata was much more spread out across different players. It's not like you have to ask one guy who contributes so much that basically the city becomes so important. And we see this in early modern times through the expansion of the so-called first loans, and everybody was asking the richest to provide so-called first loans. There is a literature about the loans acquired by the Spanish crown that somebody, especially in the Anglo-Saxon court, tend to interpret as the proof of authoritarian tendencies by the Spanish monarchy, but in fact it wasn't that, because everybody was asking first loans, right? And they were forced, technically, but in practice they were always negotiated. And when I say everybody, I mean that also the Republic of Venice was using first loans. But when a patrician republic does that, it's clear that the bargain, is a little bit different. It's not, not only a matter of, say, almost expropriation. It's not that. Because an interesting feature of the Venetian Republic is that it never went bankrupt instead. Never in its long history. Why is that? Well, because the people who decided whether to ask loans, forced loans, were also the people who then had to pay the loan. And they were also the people who knew perfectly well that the loan, which by the way paid an interest, was perfectly safe. It would never have gone bankrupt on what was basically their own private loans to the state. Right? So the matter is kind of complicated. But then you find also other instances in which exceptional contributions, so actually ad hoc taxes are asked from the richer strata. And this happens repeatedly. It happens famines, it happens when you have epidemics, because then you have the need to acquire goods, including food we bought from the outside. It happens to prepare for sieges, it happens during wars, it happens all the time. And this case was kind of a much more direct, immediate contribution. So yes, that's a problem if you do this. I mean, it allows for the build-up of political power in the short run if you do this in a too concentrated way. But if you do this across the board, I don't think that there is reason to worry about that historical reason.
Well, congrats. I have just two short questions, just for context, because when you were answered their question, you have already answered one of my questions. So, and also I get a little curious about a lot of aspects about your presentation, because it was very interesting. Congrats. And my questions are, you were talking about a trade between Italy and French when you were presenting the characters, I think so. I would like to know what consists or what terms and requires were delimiting that trade. And the second is about the commercial revolution on the 11th and 12th century. What occurred in those situations, and perhaps those revolutions made a negative effect on the riches, because the common people get more opportunities to increase their earnings. So, yeah.
So beginning with the last part. So the so-called commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th century is basically the reopening of ancient trade routes. It's the strengthening of economic interaction between different sides of the Mediterranean area, mostly beginning with the sea routes actually across the Mediterranean, and it allows, it brings plenty of opportunities to profit, both from the exploitation of trade directly, so the simple transfer of goods between different production areas, and from the increase in the opportunities to expand production, for example, production of specialized products, for example, textiles in Italy and the Low Countries and other products that you have. And the other side of the story is also that the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages triggers the need for more and better financial services, because you need to have credit very far from where you have, because you need to have ready money to fund your shipments and so forth and so on. So all this starts to generate a situation in which progressively you have an expansion in production of goods, in the trade of goods, and in the provision of financial services. Then for the Mediterranean, the next step is expanding this interaction between the Mediterranean area and the Baltic and North Sea area, which puts into contact these two parts of Europe which were economically very advanced, so say Italy and the Low Countries. And then you can even consider the beginning of the opening of the Atlantic trade route in the 15th century. So the story of the Portuguese try and get to India by circumnavigating Africa, and this begins, they begin in the very early 15th century. It takes them a century to finally get, 1498, a few years after Columbus gets to America. And that's very much the continuation of this earlier period, especially from the technological point of view. They were needing different kinds of ships, which basically emerged from bringing together some innovations which happened in the north and in the south. It's kind of very organic thing. So, and again, the kind of services needed are pretty much the same, and then you have this kind of continuous interaction between different sectors of the economy in different ways to operate, which continuously produces new opportunities. I think there was some other thing you asked me, but I don't remember, or did I answer everything?
Yeah, it's alright.
Okay.
Thank you.
Greetings, Mr. Alfani. Thank you for this position. It was really great. I like it a lot. I have a question about a particular fact, it's like comparison. Which could be the difference between the decision and use of income/capital of super rich in British Empire and Spanish Empire in the late modernity?
Sorry, you didn't get the question. Could you repeat?
Do I repeat again?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Which could be the difference in the decision and use of income on the super rich of British Empire and Spanish Empire in the late modernity? Did you hear it better?
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
So, first, if we think about income and wealth, we are thinking about different things. Okay, so wealth is intrinsically something which can be concentrated much more because it can be accumulated and grow across time. Okay, so while income is connected to what you are getting into a specific, it's a flux variable compared to a stock variable. So if we think about the different conditions experienced in this process by the Spanish crown and the English crown, well, first, I would not stress too much the differences unless we focus on some very specific issues. For example, the greater investment opportunities across the board, which were given to the English by the different way in which we're organizing the exploitation of the Atlantic trade. So the fact that the English and the Dutch as well established trading companies was stock was private basically and could be traded in an easy way, is something that allowed for a more generalized enrichment, and I mean for more people getting into the business compared to a monopoly system of the kind used, for example, by the Portuguese. Okay? So the fact here is that even sectors of society which do not directly become involved in that business because they were asked not to dirty their hands with the kind of activity. For example, the nobility in England were instead entirely allowed to become investors in the English East Indies Company, for example. It is something that opened this opportunity to them as well. And then the problem is how this morphs in time into the process leading to the Industrial Revolution, which is now we understand Industrial Revolution as a much more long-run process than we previously did. So the premises for these are in the center. It's not only something which happens from the 18th century. And then the way in which the Industrial Revolution happens in England is again something which allows broader set of society, again including the nobles, many sectors, to profit from it, and also the first Industrial Revolution in particular requires little capital to play the game. So to start a small manufactory in the very beginning of the first Industrial Revolution doesn't require a lot of capital compared to other activities. Even for international trade, for the kind of international trade happening at the very beginning of the early modern period, the amount of capital needed was much larger. So that also kind of changes a bit the way in which the opportunities for enrichment were spread across society. So that I would say is a difference. The way in which Britain became involved in the Atlantic trade and the way in which then this led to directly the Industrial Revolution allowed for more people to follow that kind of pattern. And when I say this, I also have to admit that we don't have any real measure of how many people were becoming richer in Spain or in England. And so this is something that still needs to be measured properly. Okay. The answer?
Muchísimas gracias, Guido, y también a ustedes por acompañarnos, por sus preguntas. Bueno, creo que hay una persona que va a hablar contigo ahora, pero si alguien más tiene otra pregunta, podemos quedarnos 10 minutos después de que formalmente concluyamos este espacio. De nuevo, muchas gracias a todos por venir.
Gracias.